So in this episode, we are going to talk about Akbar's government, his administration, his bureaucracy, and how he managed this gigantic empire stretching across much of southern Asia. Akbar divided his empire into 18 subhas, or provinces. These were Delhi, Agra, Awadh, Allahabad, Ajmer, Gujarat, Bengal, Bihar, Orissa, Malwa, Sindh, Multan, Lahore, Kabul, Kashmir, Khandesh, Ahmadnagar, and Berar. Each province was ruled by a subadar, or governor, and each province was also divided into districts called Sarkars. Each district was governed by a faujdar, or chief district officer, and the Sarkars, or these districts, were further divided into pargana, or rural counties. Akbar improved on and expanded the improvements made by Sher Shah Suri. And if you're not familiar with who Sher Shah Suri was, he was the Afghan ruler who overthrew Humayun and briefly ruled over North India. Again, listen to Season 8 if you want more information about Sher Shah Suri and his dynasty. Now, some of these improvements that Akbar made over Sher Shah Suri's improvements were an improved postal system, better communications and road network, some of which still exist today, by the way, and also a land revenue system. Speaking of land, Akbar's empire was divided into imperial lands and jagirs. The imperial lands were under Akbar's authority, or under the emperor's authority. Taxes were collected from these lands by imperial agents, and then they went straight into the imperial treasury. Jagirs, however, were non-hereditary feudal lands that were given to nobles, and these nobles were either Mansabdar or Jagirdar. A Jagirdar is a feudal lord. Honestly, they still exist today in the Indian subcontinent. However, a Mansabdar was a Mughal official, and they may or may not have been a Jagirdar. The Mansabdar's lands and titles were not hereditary. The lands could be transferred from him to somebody else in case perhaps he fell out of favor with the emperor. And when the Mansabdar died, when this Mughal official died, the lands reverted back to imperial control. Each noble's rank, or mansab, was based on how many soldiers and cavalry he could maintain. For example, if a noble had 1,000 zat, that meant he had 1,000 infantry. And if he had 500 sawar, that meant he had 500 cavalry. Now, it did not necessarily have to be soldiers per se. It didn't mean that the only people that this man commanded, or this noble commanded, were only soldiers or military men, because sometimes their zat, or their infantry, or the men under their authority might be artists or doctors or other professions. However, over time, zat did come to mean the noble's salary, and sawar came to mean the men that this noble could bring to war. These jagirs, or non-hereditary fiefs, allowed Akbar to give his nobles a salary in a way. So say, for instance, the jagir, or the feudal land, produced excess tax revenue above and beyond the noble's agreed upon salary. Then the excess of that went to the imperial treasury. But let's say there was a bad year or a bad crop harvest and it did not produce enough tax revenue to cover the noble's salary, then the imperial treasury was used to bridge the gap. This was a way for Akbar to keep the nobles pacified, loyal, and under control. Speaking of taxes, land taxes were a major part of the Mughal revenue system. Let's remember that this was an agricultural society. So the lands within the Mughal Empire was measured using a standard length called a jadib. Now, jadib fluctuated over time, but it may have been between 1,500 to 6,000 square meters. In addition to its size, land was also classified based upon its productivity. So land could be classified as very fertile or as barren, and anywhere in between along that spectrum. So they took the size of the land and the productivity or the fertility of the land and combined them to determine the taxes that were owed on that land. Another thing that Akbar did was switch from the lunar calendar to the solar calendar. Now, of course, we know as Muslims that the lunar calendar is preferred for religious reasons. But again, this was an agricultural society, and crop harvests are based upon the sun, based upon the seasons that are based upon the sun. And so, since taxes were based upon the crop harvest, the solar calendar was a better tool to track time for tax collection. Akbar also had a very strong government and administrative bureaucracy. So let's talk about some of the government offices under his administration. Every royal decree that Akbar gave was recorded, reproduced, and verified multiple times over. So this led to very thorough record keeping and very strong accountability. However, this also led to lots of red tape and lots of bureaucracy. And when you have red tape and bureaucracy, then you have the opportunity for corruption. There were 4 primary imperial offices, and these existed at both the provincial level as well as the imperial level. Think of it sort of like if you're in the United States at like the federal level and the state level. So there was the Duan, which was the finance ministry, Mir Bakhshi, which was in control of the military, Mir Saman, which organized trade, and Sadr or Qadi, which was the judicial and religious affairs ministry. There were other minor offices, and we'll run through them briefly right now. Muhtasib, which was the ombudsman. This person listened and reconciled complaints from the public. Mustawfi, or the auditor general. Nasiri Buyutat, superintendent of the imperial workshop. Mushrif, the revenue secretary. Mir Bahri, head of the navy or admiral, so to speak. Mir Bar, the supreme commander of all forts. Korbegi, head of the imperial stables. Kawan Salar, the imperial chef. Waqai Nawis, head spy or master of whispers for you Game of Thrones fans. And finally, Kotwal, or the sheriff. These imperial officers could be paid through the jagir, these non-hereditary feudal lands, or through cash straight from the treasury. Now, in addition to Akbar's various offices and administrative offices, he also had some very competent advisors, the 9 jewels or Navaratnas or Navaratnas. This was kind of like his cabinet, his closest advisors, the people who he depended on the most for making decisions. Let's run through them now. Number 1, the top dog, one of his closest advisors was Abul Fadl ibn Mubarak. That was the Mughal prime minister. Abul Fadl was born in 1551. His brother, whose name was Faizi, was another one of Akbar's ministers, and we're going to talk about him in a few minutes. Abul Fadl and Faizi's father was an Islamic scholar, and he passed on his Islamic knowledge to his 2 sons. The father was also a Greek literature and philosophy scholar, and he passed that on to his sons as well. This additional knowledge, this knowledge of Greek philosophy, influenced the sons' Islamic knowledge and their understanding of Islam. Abul Fadl was appointed to Akbar's court in 1575 by Akbar. Abul Fadl also had 3 wives, one Hindu, one Sunni, and one Shia. Abul Fadl's influence had a major impact on Akbar's religious thinking. Abul Fadl was critical in leading Akbar astray from Islam. He influenced Akbar tremendously. Abul Fadl, however, did also write the Akbarnama, or Akbar's biography, as well as another addendum or addition to the Akbarnama called the Aini Akbari, or the Regulations of Akbar. Now, these books are historically valuable and very useful for understanding Akbar's life, but when you read them, you have to understand that you are reading Akbar's best friend, or one of his best friends writing, that's somebody who wanted to please Akbar, so there's definitely a lot of bias in these books. On to number 2, Faizi, the second of Akbar's 9 jewels. Faizi was Akbar's Minister of Education, and he was born in Agra in 1547. And along with his brother, Abul Fadl, he helped to send Akbar astray from Islam. Faizi was also a respected poet and became the official poet of Akbar's court. Faizi wrote hundreds of poems, and the famous book of poetry, Tabashir al-Subh, is a collection of his poems. In 1588, Faizi became the Sadr, or religious official, for the states of Agra, Kalanjar, and Kalpi. Number 3, we have Raja Todarmal, the finance minister. Raja Todarmal was a Hindu born in 1500. He was initially appointed by Sher Shah Suri to build a fort in the Punjab. When Akbar defeated the Suri dynasty, he placed Raja Todarmal in charge of Agra, and from there, Raja Todarmal eventually became governor of Gujarat. Raja Todarmal was responsible for revamping and improving the Mughal Empire's economic system. He brought in various financial and taxation innovations such as efficient land surveying systems, standardized weights and measures, as well as revenue districts. In fact, some of his financial systems are still in use today. Number 4 was Raja Birbal. That was Akbar's foreign minister. Raja Birbal was born in 1528 to a Hindu Brahmin family, and he was very much experienced in poetry, literature, and music. In fact, he became very famous for his music and his poetry. Before he joined Akbar's court, he was a member of Raja Ramchandra's court. Raja Ramchandra was the Rajput ruler of what would eventually become the Rewa princely state and is now located in the modern Indian state of Madhya Pradesh. Raja Ramchandra fought against Akbar but eventually surrendered to him, and we discussed this in the previous season. Look for episode 8-15. Raja Birbal joined Akbar's court somewhere between 1556 and 1562. He began as just a simple court poet, but he would eventually serve nearly 3 decades as one of Akbar's religious and military advisors. In fact, Raja Birbal and Akbar were very close friends, and it actually led to some rivalry and jealousy amongst the other members of Akbar's court. Raja Birbal was the only Hindu to convert to Akbar's, lack of a better phrase, made-up religion called Din-e-Ilahi. Raja Birbal met his end, however, when he led a military campaign into northwest India in 1586, where he was fatally wounded. Number 5, Raja Man Singh. This was Akbar's chief of staff for the Mughal military. Raja Man Singh was born in 1550 to a Hindu family. Akbar was actually married to one of Raja Man Singh's aunts, and that might have been why Akbar appointed him to his court, perhaps trying to strengthen those family ties and keep these Rajputs in his sphere of influence. Raja Man Singh's responsibilities steadily grew over time. In 1589, he was in charge of 5,000 soldiers. However, by 1605, he was in charge of 7,000 soldiers. In fact, Raja Man Singh had the largest number of soldiers under his command for any man in the Mughal Empire who wasn't one of Akbar's sons. Interestingly, Akbar often referred to Raja Man Singh as his son. Raja Man Singh led the Mughal army against Rana Pratap at the Battle of Haldigat in 1576. The 6th member of Akbar's 9 jewels was Tansen, who was the court musician. He was a renowned singer, and he impressed Akbar with his service in the court of Raja Ramchandra, whom we just spoke about a few minutes ago. Tansen joined Akbar's court in 1562 when he was 60 years old, and he was given the title of Mian, which means learned man. Tansen was a major contributor to Hindustani classical music, mostly coming out of northern India. His compositions helped to develop several regional schools of music in northern India called Gharana. And he also wrote 2 books about music. Number 7 was Kani Khanan Abdurrahim, Akbar's defense minister. Now that name sounds familiar. Kani Khanan Abdurrahim, that's because we spoke about him extensively in our series on Malik Ambar. Kani Khanan Abdurrahim, or just Abdurrahim, was a son of Bairam Khan. Now that name sounds familiar. That was Akbar's former regent and his advisor before they had a falling out. After Bairam Khan died, Akbar married his widow. Her name was Salima Sultan Begum, and Abdurrahim, who was only 4 years old at the time, basically became Akbar's stepson. It may seem like there was a big gap in age between Akbar and Salima Sultan Begum, his wife, who was also the widow of Bairam Khan, who was his former regent, but not necessarily so. Bairam Khan was in his 60s at least when he died. However, Salima Sultan Begum was in her 20s, and Akbar was also in his 20s, so he was only a couple of years younger than her. So it wasn't really a big difference in age. After Bayram Khan died, Akbar married Salima Sultan Begum. He brought her and her son Abdurrahim to his court, and then Akbar arranged a marriage between Abdurrahim and the daughter of a Mughal noble, and Abdurrahim wound up serving Akbar throughout much of the rest of his life, and also served under Akbar's son Jahangir. And there's going to be a lot of interesting discussion about Jahangir and Akbar in the coming episodes, inshallah. Number 8 was Fakir Azioddin. This was Akbar's religious minister. We don't really know much about this one. He supposedly advised Akbar on religious affairs. The word fakir means sage in Urdu, but that's really all I got about him. I don't have much more to say about him. And the 9th jewel was Mullah Do Piazza, the Minister of Home Affairs. He supposedly handled and managed internal security, especially the police force. However, some scholars believe this was a fake person, and he might even have been nothing more than a court jester. So that's Akbar's 9 jewels, his closest advisors. All right, now on to what you really came here for. Politics and warfare. Let's get into it. So Akbar launched several new campaigns in the late 1500s, but before we get into the campaigns themselves, we got to talk about the Safavids. The Safavids, those are the guys who ruled Persia. The Safavids were under a lot of pressure. They were under pressure from both the Ottomans to their west and the Uzbeks to their east. The Safavids in the previous years had already lost Baghdad and Tabriz to the Ottomans in 1534, when the Ottoman Empire was being led by Suleiman I, also known as Suleiman the Magnificent. This was especially harmful, especially brutal for the Safavids, because Tabriz was the Safavid former capital. However, the Ottomans were not able to hold on to Tabriz and eventually had to let it go, but they held on to Baghdad for the next 90 years. Now, there was still a rivalry going on between the Safavids and the Uzbeks over control of eastern Persia and western Afghanistan. Understand, these lines that we have today didn't exist back then. The Uzbeks wound up capturing Herat, which is now in Afghanistan, as well as Sistan and Mashhad, both of which are in Persia, in 1587. These losses forced the Safavid ruler Muhammad Khudabanda to abdicate the throne in 1587. His son Abbas I became the new Safavid emperor. Now, with all this chaos going on, the Safavids losing cities and them fighting with the Uzbeks and emperors abdicating, Akbar took advantage of these situations and began to expand his empire. Now let's talk about some of Akbar's campaigns, particularly in Pakistan, or what is now Pakistan. First, there's Sindh. In 1592, Kani Khan and Abdurrahim led a Mughal empire into Sindh, which is in Pakistan, of course. He defeated the ruler of Sindh, a man named Jani Beg, in 2 battles. Jani Beg then traveled to Lahore and personally submitted to Akbar. Akbar said, "Cool, you are my vassal now," and sent him back to rule Sindh as a subjugated ruler, as a vassal of the Mughal Empire. So with this victory, Akbar now ruled over Umarkot, which was actually the land of his birth. On to Baluchistan. Akbar sent an army to Baluchistan in 1595 and captured the fortress of Siwi in the Kirthar Mountains south of Quetta, and I hope I got those pronunciations correct. Then on to Kandahar. The Persian ruler of Kandahar, the Safavid ruler of Kandahar, which is in Afghanistan, of course, was already worried about the Uzbeks coming in to invade. And when Akbar sent an expedition to Kandahar, the ruler quickly submitted to Akbar without even putting up a fight. He preferred to be under Akbar's authority than the Uzbeks' authority. Much later on, much later on, this is going to become the focus of a dispute between the Mughals and the Safavids, but we're not there just yet. However, with these conquests, Akbar now controlled most of Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and North India. The Safavids actually began to make a comeback around the same time as well. As we mentioned, the previous emperor had abdicated and his son Abbas I took over. Well, Safavid Emperor Shah Abbas I was a very dynamic and very competent ruler. He defeated or neutralized all of his internal rivals. Then he went and struck deals with the powerful clans in the west to pacify them and also act as a buffer against the Ottomans. Then he brought in a bunch of European military advisors to help him reorganize his army. And then he began building hundreds of cannons and hundreds of thousands of muskets. So while the Safavids were rising back to glory, the Uzbeks were in shambles. They were falling apart. The Uzbek regime was known as the Bukhara Khanate, and the Bukhara Khanate was just falling apart from internal strife. Abdullah Khan, who was the Uzbek ruler of the Bukhara Khanate, was fighting a rebellion that was being led by his own son. With the Uzbeks so wrapped up with fighting themselves, they were unable. They could not stop Shah Abbas I from retaking the lands that they had taken from him in eastern Persia and western Afghanistan. Abdullah Khan died in 1598, and his rebellious son succeeded him. But then the son was killed by the rebels as well, and that brought the Shaybani dynasty to an end, which had been begun by Shaybani Khan. And if that name sounds familiar, that's because that's Babur's old rival. So now let's get into a little bit of family drama with Akbar. Okay, now Akbar had 3 sons and at least 3 grandsons. His eldest son was named Salim. He was born in 1569, and we discussed his birth in episode 8-15. The next oldest son was Murad Mirza. Murad Mirza was born in 1570. And the youngest was Daniel, who was born in 1572. Prince Salim's wife gave birth to 3 sons, so these are now Akbar's grandsons. There was Khusro, born in 1587, Parvez, born in 1589, and Khurram, born in 1592. Remember these names. Remember these names, because we're going to have a lot to say about Khusro and Khurram coming up later in this series, inshallah. The relationship between Akbar and his sons was strained, to say the least. Akbar had primarily lived in Lahore since he conquered Kashmir back in 1586. His sons, however, who would have been teenagers in 1586, remained in Agra. Akbar moved back to Agra in 1599 so he could manage the campaign in the Deccan, which had begun in the early 1590s. So by this time, 13 years had passed, and the sons that were teenagers were now adult men, and Akbar was disappointed in all 3 of them. All 3 of his sons were alcoholics. In fact, his second oldest son, Murad Mirza, wound up dying of alcohol poisoning in that same year in 1599. His 2 other sons, Daniel and Salim, they didn't trust each other. The palace was full of schemes and plots and rumors as these 2 young men were preparing to go to war with each other as soon as Akbar hit the ground and was dead. They had lost most of their respect for their father because they hadn't seen him in so many years. They grew up without him. Here's an example of their disrespect, or at least Salim's disrespect for his father, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's going to be a lot more to come, inshallah. While Akbar was visiting Kashmir in 1589, he ordered Prince Salim to bring the harem to Kashmir. Remember, Akbar was living in Lahore, and he went to, vacation in Kashmir, and he ordered his son Salim to bring the harem, to bring his women. Okay, let's just be honest. He wanted his son to bring his women so Akbar could go on vacation with the women of his harem, all right? There's no other way to put it. Salim decided that it was too dangerous, and so he disobeyed his father, left the harem behind, left the women behind, and arrived in Kashmir by himself with no women. This was not fun for Akbar, who wants to spend all this time on vacation with no women. So he had to go all the way back to Lahore. Akbar himself, the emperor, had to go back to Lahore and get the harem for himself. Now, we spoke about the Deccan campaign a few minutes ago. We're not going to get too deep into this because, first of all, I mentioned it a little bit in the previous season, but we also, once again, went to some really good depth into this campaign in our Malik Ambar series, but we'll gloss over it so at least you're up to speed of what's going on. So Akbar used a succession crisis in Ahmednagar to justify or as an excuse to start moving into the Deccan. He sent his son Murad and Kani Khanan to subdue the Deccan in 1594. Murad Mirza and Kani Khanan, however, they didn't really get along. They bickered and they couldn't really organize their efforts in this battle, in this fighting. Murad's alcoholism was also a hindrance, and eventually Abdurrahim, Kani Khanan Abdurrahim, and Murad Mirza wound up striking a very unsatisfactory peace deal with the Ahmednagar Sultanate. Akbar didn't like this deal, and so he sent Abul Fadl down there to replace Prince Murad in late 1598, and that's when Murad died. Murad died just a few days later from alcohol poisoning in early 1599. With his death, Akbar entered into a state of mourning and mourned his son for the next 6 months. So Murad died in early 1599. Akbar came out of mourning around July 1599, and then he led the army down to the Deccan himself. As he went down to the Deccan, he left his son Prince Salim in Agra and left him with orders to march into southern Rajputana, to take over southern Rajputana, which is located in west central India. Now, I told you these sons didn't have much respect for their father. Salim initially acted as if he was going to obey his father. He set out with an army and headed west towards Mewar as if he's going to go and take over Rajputana. But here's what Prince Salim did. He turns back around, goes back to Agra, and raids the treasury. Remember, his father, the emperor, is on his way down to the Deccan. Akbar is in the Deccan. Prince Salim raids the imperial treasury and then heads east, not west, east towards Allahabad. He then basically fired his father's officials and replaced them with his own officials and begins to mint coins in his name. So Prince Salim has, for all intents and purposes, basically staged a coup against his father. But it's really a minor coup. It's not a really, really big coup because he didn't take Agra, he took Allahabad. This is a messy situation. Akbar is stuck in the Deccan, and quite frankly, he isn't doing too well down there either. And even though he had some successes down at the Deccan, he was not able to pacify all of the Deccan sultanates. And again, we discussed this in much more depth in the Malik Ambar series. We're going to come back to Salim and Akbar, inshallah, in the next episode. But for right now, I want to shift gears just a little bit and talk about the East India Company, the EIC. You're probably familiar with the East India Company as a British or English corporation, but the story actually starts with the Spanish Armada. In 1588, Spain was the most powerful nation in Europe. Spain attempted to invade England with this huge armada of 130 ships. However, due to England's exceptional navy, due to England's bad weather, and due to sickness, Spain was defeated. And with their defeat, this opened the door for other nations to get involved in the spice trade, especially to the East Indies. So the story of the EIC begins with the defeat of the Spanish Armada and continues with the Netherlands. The Netherlands had recently gained independence from Spain in 1579. And with this newfound freedom and independence, they began exploring overseas trade routes and networks. In 1598, the Dutch admiral Jacob Corneliszoon, I hope I got that right, returned from a successful trade venture in Indonesia. Now, with the success of this venture, the Dutch really wanted to get into trading with Indonesia and with the East Indies, and so they tried to buy as many ships as they could. And they went to the English and tried to buy ships from them so they could expand their trade networks into East India, into the East Indies. And the Dutch even tried to buy English ships to help further this expansion into the East Indies. Well, this completely insulted and angered the English that this small Dutch nation, the Netherlands, would come to them for ships. And the English were like, well, shoot, we can do this ourselves. So they refused to sell the Dutch any ships, and they were determined to start a trade venture of their own into Asia. And with that, a joint stock company was formed. Now, joint stock companies were considered a much safer business venture than trying to go into these things alone. Overseas trade and shipping in this era, in the 16th century, was very dangerous, very risky, and prohibitively expensive. So to spread the risks and the costs, it was better to bring in a lot of investors. And this had been done before. The East India Company is not the first example of this. In 1553, the English formed a company called the Muscovy Company that was meant to find a northern route to South Asia going through Russia. It didn't quite work out, but the idea was there. In 1592, they formed the Levant Company, which was meant to manage trade between England and the Ottoman Empire. And so with that, in September 1599, John Smythe, the Auditor of London, gathered a group of London merchants and adventurers. The purpose of this was to petition Queen Elizabeth I to charter a British joint stock company so they could pursue trade with India. Most of the shares in this new company were owned by British merchants and aristocrats. However, Queen Elizabeth wasn't really feeling it. She initially rejected their petition because she was in the middle of peace negotiations with the Spanish. And she didn't want this new idea, this new company, to complicate the negotiation process between her and Spain. But over time, the negotiations dragged on, the Spanish didn't move fast enough, and Queen Elizabeth, she started to become more receptive to the idea. And finally, she approved their petition in the following year, and the East India Company received its royal charter on December 31st, 1600. That's going to do it for this episode. Inshallah, in the next episode, we will discuss the early years of the East India Company. We will also discuss Akbar's death and the rise of his successor, Emperor Jahangir.